The Promise. In a small park in the town of N, a young man and a young woman sat on a bench beneath a broad-leafed horse chestnut. The girl's name was Lilia, and she was indeed like a lily, fragile and beautiful and pleasantly scented. The young man, however, always introduced himself by his surname, Kreutz, as if he had no given name at all, or perhaps wishing to signal to everyone that he was German. In truth, when in the company of his peers, he drank vodka just like any other great Russian, tossing it back from a square glass and chasing it with a handful of sauerkraut. The young man wore a light suit, though he had loosened his tie and opened his collar. Leaning against the edge of the bench beside him was his walking stick, his hat perched atop its handle. In appearance, he was a petit bourgeois of modest means, working as a broker in the town's only real estate office, owned by one Moise Moisetz. The girl, dressed in a thin summer gown of pink and pale blue, worked at the bank as a humble clerk, or a teller, as the more modern fashion called it. In their hands, blue 0.33-liter cans of long drink glinted in the sun, from which they occasionally moistened lips parched with love. A law recently passed by the Riigikogu had just come into effect, permitting the consumption of alcohol on park benches and streets. Thus, the young couple had no need to fear a policeman creeping up behind them to place a hand on their shoulders. The sun was dipping toward evening. A total silence reigned. Summer had reached the second half of its journey and the birds had ceased their singing. Only the faint hum of cars from the town's main street and the clatter of tram wheels on the rails disturbed this beautiful, almost holy stillness. The young man and the woman spoke of literature. Kreutz was by ancestry a Little Russian, though he considered himself German. Consequently, he did not pronounce the name of a certain writer as Nikolai Gogol, but in the manner of a Little Russian, Nikola Hohol, replacing the G sounds with H's. But the girl liked this. She liked the word Hohol, for Kreutz was indeed a Hohol, her dear Hohol, like a yellow sunflower shimmering in the sun. Soon the talk of literature bored the young man, for such a conversation in this setting, on a summer evening with a girl on a park bench, was neither progressive nor purposeful. It was not, so to speak, sustainable. Kreutz placed his arm around the girl's waist and attempted to kiss her, but Lilia laughed coquettishly, pressed a forbidding finger to her lips, and said softly, "Be patient, my darling. Wait until evening. Come to the meadow outside of town at sunset by the haystacks. I shall offer you something sweet, so very, very sweet." Upon parting, the girl gave the young man a fleeting peck on the cheek, a mere light appetizer, and skipped away with a playful smile. Having reached home, his one-room apartment, Kreutz began his preparations for the evening tryst. His heart hammered anxiously. First, it was necessary to change his wardrobe. Having tossed his jacket over the back of a chair and torn off his trousers, he stood in the middle of the room as if in a daze, still in his dress shirt and tie. Before his eyes, the pink and blue vision of the girl flickered again and again, her shining eyes and luscious red lips. In his ears echoed her words uttered in a half-whisper. "Come to the meadow outside of town at sunset by the haystacks. I shall offer you something sweet, so very, very sweet." Kreutz snapped out of it, ripped off his tie and threw it onto the bed, though he left his shirt on. Again there was a pause. Excitement had paralyzed his ability to act or think. As if in a dream, he went to the wardrobe, took a pair of gym shorts from the shelf, pulled them on, and tied the drawstring. Then he changed his mind, kicked the shorts off, and grabbed a tracksuit from the cupboard. The elastic waistband held them up, and they were very comfortable. Kreutz smirked to himself with satisfaction. But then, breathless with agitation, he stripped the trousers off again, tore off his underwear, flung them to the floor, and pulled the tracksuit back on. Now, he was ready to meet the girl in the evening meadow by the haystack. The young man hurried toward the meeting place. Passing his place of work, the real estate office, he noticed the owner, Moise Moisetz, lounging in an open upstairs window, eating sunflower seeds. As his subordinate came level with the window, Moise spat out a mouthful of shells and called down, "Off to see the women, then?" The question was asked with such indifference and lack of passion that it was a statement of fact rather than an inquiry. The young man shrugged in response. The Jew shouted after him, "You watch yourself, Kreutz. With women, it is one eternal Kreutz." Author's note: Kreutz, German for cross. The young man reached the floodplains on the edge of town. The sun was setting. A thin veil of mist was descending upon the meadow, and the air held the scent of dried hay, fresh manure, and warm milk. In the distance, in the shade of the forest edge, the milkmaids of the local cooperative were busy milking cows, laughing and shouting playful, double-edged witticisms at one another. Wearing galoshes on his bare feet and linen trousers, the chairman and owner of the cooperative, an impoverished minor noble named Porcipea, wandered among the milkmaids like an old tomcat, stout and pot-bellied. For some reason, the milkmaids called him the Red Baron. It was difficult to tell whether he hungered for the warm milk or for the women. The cows, having gorged themselves on the fresh aftergrass, flicked their tails lazily and moved their jaws in slow rumination. Kreutz scanned the meadow searching for the girl. Suddenly, something flashed behind a haystack and vanished instantly. The young man's heart leaped. He ran to the stack, wishing to catch Lilia in a hot embrace, but the girl laughed teasingly and ran from him. The chase around the haystack lasted for some time. The young man felt his breath catch and his veins swell from the heat of passion. But suddenly, Lilia stopped and threw herself onto her back upon the hay. Kreutz began to kiss the girl fiercely and passionately, on the lips, the neck, the breast. Lilia laughed flirtatiously and pushed him away gently, though it seemed mere pretense. "Kreutz, I didn't promise you that." Suddenly, as if rising from the earth itself, a massive figure loomed before them, blotting out the setting sun. The figure brandished a three-pronged pitchfork, and immediately the angry voice of the minor noble Porcipea rang out like a peal of thunder.
"What are you doing here? Get off my land!"
The girl sprang to her feet to flee, but she turned back and handed the young man a red rooster lollipop. "I promised you something sweet, so very, very sweet." A moment later, she vanished behind the bushes bordering the meadow. Kreutz and the minor noble, Porcipea, remained, glaring at each other in fury. Suddenly, the young man wrenched the digging fork from Porcipea's grasp and drove it with all his might into the nobleman's bulging belly. Porcipea fell onto his back, the handle of the fork standing upright. Kreutz paced his room nervously, his heart pierced by a multitude of conflicting emotions all at once. Anger, shame, indignation, unfulfilled desire, and the terror and regret of his monstrous act. He stepped to the bookcase, opened its top drawer, and thrust his hand under some papers. His fingers touched cold iron. The young man took the pistol and turned it hesitantly in his hand. It was a single-shot pistol, crafted by God knows what amateur for God knows whom. He had bought it at some junk fair, not even knowing why, prompted by some vague emotional impulse. Kreutz cocked the hammer and looked down the barrel. A cartridge sat in the chamber. He did not know if the cartridge was live or if it was merely an empty casing that someone had neglected to remove after firing. The young man was not interested in such things now. He was in a kind of trance. What mattered was the pistol as an object that offered emotional satisfaction in this moment. Kreutz stepped before the mirror, observing his face, in which he found it difficult to recognize himself, and placed the pistol to his right temple. A little further, then a little closer. He turned his hand and aimed the pistol into his left eye, then the right. Finally, he poked the muzzle into a nostril, but feeling discomfort, he opened his mouth and thrust the end of the barrel inside. He pulled the trigger playfully, first with his pinky, then with his middle finger. The trigger creaked slightly. He pressed with his index finger. Kreutz heard a bang, and instantly it was as if he had been struck in the head with a blunt object. His head fell back, and the last thing he saw was his own hair hanging down from a shard of bone stuck to the ceiling.
Thank you for listening. To discover more stories, follow the link in the description below.